Disclaimer. $870 billion. That is the number that proves the U.S. economy is mathematically broken. According to the Congressional Budget Office's own 2024 report, the government now spends more on interest payments than on the entire United States military. This isn't just a budget error. It is a mathematical, structural failure. And if you open the ledger, you see exactly who is stealing the value from your bank account. The Federal Reserve inflation lie began on a specific day, April 28, 2021. Jerome Powell looked into the camera and told you price hikes were just transitory. History shows this was a critical miscalculation. Whether it was an error or a strategic omission to keep the bond market calm, the result was the same. At that exact moment, the fuse on a $10 trillion bomb was already burning. Let me show you the precise second the explosion hit the ledger. For 60 years, the U.S. money supply looked like a gentle hill. It was predictable. It was stable. Then, in 2020, it became a vertical wall. In just 24 months, the Federal Reserve printed $6 trillion. That is 40% of all U.S. dollars in existence, created in 2 years. Now, the government told you this was stimulus. They sent you a check for $1,200 and called it help. But here is the mechanics of the trap. Money is a claim on energy and time. It is finite. Think of the economy like a pizza. If you cut the pizza into 8 slices, you have a meal. If you cut that same pizza into 80 slices, you don't have more food. You just have paper-thin crust. When they printed that $6 trillion, they didn't create more houses, more oil, or more factories. They just sliced the currency into dust. This is the definition of currency debasement. Every dollar they printed diluted the value of the dollars you spent your life saving. The check they sent you, that wasn't free money. It was a bribe paid with your own future purchasing power. But here's the part they rely on you not understanding. The inflation didn't hit everyone at the same time. This is a mechanism discovered in the 18th century by an Irish banker named Richard Cantillon. He proved that money flows like honey, not water. It is sticky. When the Fed prints $6 trillion, they don't drop it from helicopters on your front lawn. They pour it into the center of the system, the big banks and financial institutions. The people closest to the poor, the insiders, get the money first at zero interest. They use it to buy hard assets like houses and stocks before prices rise. By the time that sticky money oozes down to your wages, the damage is already done. The insiders have already bid up the price of everything you need to survive. This isn't just inflation, it is a wealth transfer. It explains the paradox of 2024. The stock market is hitting all-time highs while you can't afford a carton of eggs. The system is designed to siphon purchasing power from the wage earner to the asset holder. So if the loss of purchasing power is this obvious, why does the official data say inflation is only 3%? Because the methodology for calculating inflation has evolved. The Consumer Price Index, or CPI, measures a basket of goods that changes over time. Critics argue it is a moving goalpost that softens the blow. They use a trick called substitution. Here is how it works. If the price of steak goes up 50%, the government statisticians assume you will stop buying steak and start buying hamburger. So they remove the steak from the inflation basket and replace it with a cheaper hamburger. The result? The report says no inflation, but your standard of living just collapsed. They do this with everything. If heating oil gets too expensive, they assume you'll wear a sweater. If rent goes up, they use a theoretical metric called owner's equivalent rent that lags reality by 12 months. The official number is a mask. It is designed to keep the bond market calm and your wages low. Because the last time a superpower tried this exact math, the result wasn't a recession, it was an incineration. To understand where we are going, you have to understand where we've been. There is a dangerous myth that hyperinflation only happens to banana republics or failing states. You think it can happen here because we have technology, universities, and sophisticated banking. But in 1913, Germany was the Silicon Valley of Europe. They had the strongest industrial base, the most advanced scientists, and the most educated population on Earth. The German citizen felt exactly the way you do right now. They trusted their institutions. They believed their bonds were risk-free. They thought their standard of living was permanent. They didn't know they were standing on a trapdoor. It didn't collapse because they weren't smart. It collapsed because the math of their debt became impossible to pay. And just like us, they tried to print their way out of it. The crime scene has a specific date. By late 1922, the German government was broke. They owed massive war debts that they couldn't pay from tax revenue. The president of the central bank, a man named Rudolf Havenstein, faced a choice. He could let the government default and admit they were bankrupt, or he could print the difference. He chose the printer. Havenstein decided that the central bank would buy 100% of the government's debt using newly created marks. He didn't call it inflation. He called it providing liquidity. He told the public he was saving the economy, but in reality, he had just signed the terminal sentence for the currency. This was the beginning of the fiat currency collapse. The moment the central bank became the only buyer of government debt, the market realized the money had no value. The dam didn't break instantly. It leaked slowly at first, but once the psychology shifted, the flood was unstoppable. What followed is the most terrifying chapter in hyperinflation history. It wasn't just that prices went up, it was the speed. The velocity of money exploded. People realized that the cash in their pocket was rotting like fruit. If you got paid at noon, you had to run to the bakery by 12:15 because by 1 p.m. the price of bread would double. There's a famous story of a student ordering a cup of coffee for 5,000 marks. By the time he finished drinking it, the waiter brought a bill for 8,000. The currency was dissolving in real time. But the true horror wasn't the price of coffee. It was the liquidation of the middle class. Families who had saved for generations, doctors, lawyers, teachers, found their life savings couldn't buy a newspaper. Desperate to survive, they sold their heirlooms. Grand pianos, silver sets, wedding rings, for sacks of potatoes. Society tore itself apart. The savers were wiped out. The prudent were punished. It looked like the end of the world. But here's the secret the history books rarely mention. Not everyone lost. Meet Hugo Stinnes. While the rest of Germany was starving, Stinnes became the wealthiest man in the world. He wasn't a magician. He just understood the mechanism of the theft before anyone else did. Stinnes realized that when the currency collapses, debt collapses with it. So while the middle class was frantically trying to save their cash, Stinnes did the opposite. He borrowed as much as he possibly could. He took out massive loans in marks and used them to buy hard assets, coal mines, ships, factories, and hotels. When the inflation hurricane hit, the value of his debt was inflated away to zero. Imagine borrowing $1 million to buy a factory, and then a month later, paying back that loan with the equivalent of a postage stamp. That is exactly what he did. He ended up owning a huge percentage of the German economy, effectively for free. His strategy was simple: short the currency, go long the real world. He understood the difference between money, which is a government promise, and wealth, which is real stuff. Stinnes knew the secret we will cover in the survivor's log later in this video. But before we get to the solution, we have to face a terrifying reality. Germany was 1922. You might be thinking, the US isn't a collapsed African state. Our bankers are Ivy League graduates. Let me introduce you to Gideon Gono. He was the central banker of Zimbabwe during their collapse in 2008. The history books paint him as an incompetent fool who didn't understand basic economics. But when you look at the transcripts, you find something much darker. He knew exactly what he was doing. In a rare interview, Gono admitted the truth. He said, "I had been condemned by traditional economists, but I found myself doing extraordinary things. If I did not print money, the soldiers would have mutinied. There would have been a coup. This is the banker's dilemma." When the choice is between hyperinflation or a government collapse, the central banker will always choose inflation. They will burn the currency to save the state. But here is the most important part of the Zimbabwe pattern. When the numbers became too embarrassing, they didn't fix the economy. They fixed the data. In 2008, the government simply stopped reporting inflation statistics. They claimed they didn't have the computer power to calculate the number. The chart went flat. The official news said the crisis was contained. Meanwhile, in the real world, a loaf of bread cost $1 trillion. They realized that if you stop measuring the fever, you can pretend the patient isn't dying. Now, look at the United States today. You're watching the exact same data blackout happen in real time, just with better marketing. For decades, the Federal Reserve focused on headline CPI, the price of everything. But when food and energy prices started exploding in 2022, that number got too hot. It was making the administration look bad. So they introduced a new metric. They call it supercore inflation. Read the definition carefully. Supercore is inflation, excluding food, excluding energy, and excluding housing costs. Think about that for a second. They created a metric that tracks the cost of living for people who don't eat, don't drive, and don't live in a house. By stripping out the things that are actually rising, they force the line on the chart to go down. Jerome Powell stands at the podium and tells you inflation is coming down to 2%. He isn't lying about the math. He is lying about the metric. Just like Gideon Gono, they have decided that it is safer to blind the public than to fix the problem. The pattern is identical. First they print, then they hide the data. If Weimar was the prologue, August 15th, 1971, was the opening chapter of the American nightmare. This event, known as the Nixon Shock 1971, explained simply, is the moment the US dollar stopped being money and started being a promise. President Nixon went on television to announce that the US would no longer redeem dollars for gold. But listen specifically to the word he used. It is the most expensive lie in history. I have directed Secretary Connolly to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Temporarily. He didn't say default, even though that is exactly what it was. He didn't say permanent, even though 54 years later, that window is still closed. He used the word suspend to keep the public calm while he pulled the foundation out from under the global economy. Before that Sunday night, $1 was a receipt for a specific amount of gold. It was finite. It was property. After that speech, $1 became a debt instrument. It became a claim on nothing but the full faith and credit of the government. And once the tether to gold was cut, there was no longer any limit on how much debt they could create. That temporary suspension allowed the debt to explode from a manageable pile into a mountain that is now $35 trillion high. This brings us to the mathematical wall we just hit. Look at this chart of U.S. debt to GDP. We are currently at 120%, the same level we were at during World War II. But there is a critical difference between then and now. In 1945, the debt was created to defeat fascism. We won the war, the soldiers came home, they built factories, and we grew our way out of the debt. Today, we are not fighting a world war. We are borrowing trillions just to keep the lights on. This is what economists call a debt spiral. We have reached the point where we have to borrow new money just to pay the interest on the old money. It's like using a MasterCard to pay off your Visa bill. It works for a month, but the math points inevitably toward bankruptcy. The system is flooded with so much cash that it should be causing massive hyperinflation right now. So why hasn't the dollar collapsed yet? Because they built a secret plumbing system to hide the excess cash, but that tank is about to run dry. To understand the next 6 months, you need to understand a boring facility with a boring name, the reverse repo market. Think of the U.S. economy like a bathtub. The Fed has been pouring water, cash, into the tub for years. Normally, that water would overflow onto the bathroom floor. That's hyperinflation. But to prevent that mess, the Fed built an overflow tank in the basement. They told the big banks, don't lend this cash to the public. Park it with us in the reverse repo facility, and we will pay you 5% interest to do nothing. It worked. They siphoned $2.5 trillion out of circulation, hiding it in this tank. This kept inflation from hitting 20%. But here's the problem. That tank is draining. As the government runs out of money, they are pulling cash out of the reverse repo facility to pay their bills. It has dropped from $2 trillion down to under $500 billion. When this tank hits zero, likely later this year, that liquidity buffer is gone. The excess cash will flood back into the real economy, triggering a second, more violent wave of inflation. And when that happens, the Fed will be powerless to stop it. Economists use a polite term for this trap, fiscal dominance. In a normal economy, the Federal Reserve is independent. If inflation gets too hot, they raise interest rates to cool it down. It's like tapping the brakes on a speeding car. But we are no longer in a normal economy. According to the St. Louis Fed's own research, when the U.S. national debt crisis reaches these levels, the brake pedal stops working. In fact, it starts acting like the gas pedal. Here is the nightmare scenario they are terrified to explain to you. If the Fed raises rates to fight inflation, the interest payments on the $35 trillion debt explode. Remember that $870 billion interest bill from the beginning of this video? If rates stay high, that bill climbs to $2 trillion. The government doesn't have that money. So what do? They have to print more money just to pay the interest on the debt they already owe. This creates a doom loop. Higher rates cause higher deficits. Higher deficits require more printing. And more printing causes higher inflation. The snake is eating its own tail. The Fed is no longer driving the car. They are tied up in the trunk. So, is hyperinflation inevitable in the US? Or is there another way out? When a government is trapped by fiscal dominance, they only have 3 mathematical options to clear the debt. Option 1, default. They simply stop paying bondholders. This would destroy the global banking system instantly. They won't do it. Option 2, austerity. They cut spending and raise taxes to pay off the debt honestly. But that would require cutting Social Security and the military by 50%. That is political self-destruction. They won't do it. That leaves only option 3. The path we're on right now, it is called financial repression. The plan is simple. Keep interest rates lower than the rate of inflation for a decade. If inflation is 5% and they pay you 4% on your bonds, the government is effectively burning 1% of the real value of the debt every single year. They aren't failing to fight inflation. They are using inflation. It is a silent tax on savers to bail out the state. They are liquidating your purchasing power to pay for their mistakes. The system is facing unprecedented pressure. When the rules of the game change, you must adapt your strategy. The first rule of wealth preservation is simple. Do not just rely on public statements. Watch the balance sheets. Actions speak louder than press conferences. Publicly, they will tell you that gold is a barbarous relic. They will tell you it yields nothing and belongs in a museum. But while they are mocking it on television, look at what they are doing in the dark. According to the World Gold Council, central banks bought 1,037 tons of gold in 2023. That is the highest level of buying in 55 years. China, Poland, Singapore, India, they are backing up the truck. Why? because they see the same fiscal dominance trap that I just showed you. They know the US debt is unpayable. They know the dollar must be diluted to keep the system alive. So they are trading their paper promises for the only asset that has no counterparty risk. They are front-running you. They are exiting the burning building while telling you to stay in your seat. You don't have to guess what happens next. We have a historical map. The last time the United States faced this level of financial repression was the 1970s. If you held the S&P 500 during that decade, your purchasing power went nowhere. The stock market churned sideways while inflation ate your gains alive. But if you held gold, it went up 2,000%. Now, understand the nuance here. It wasn't that gold became 20 times more valuable. An ounce of gold bought the same amount of bread in 1980 as it did in 1970. It was that the dollar collapsed against the gold. Remember Hugo Stinnes from Act 2? This is the exact same strategy he used. He didn't hold the dying currency, he held the hard asset. Stinnes bought factories and mines. Central banks are buying bullion. The asset class changes, but the principle is eternal. When the government is forced to debase the currency, you must own things that cannot be printed. And the good news is, you don't need to be a billionaire industrialist to do it. This brings us to the final solution, the personal gold standard. You cannot stop the Federal Reserve from printing. You cannot stop the debt spiral. Those forces are bigger than you. But you have the power to choose which currency you save your life's energy in. You can leave your labor stored in the government ledger, where they can dilute it, tax it, and inflate it away. Or you can move your labor into physics, into something that is finite. Now, let me be clear. I'm an investigator, not a financial advisor. I'm not telling you to sell everything and buy gold to get rich. I'm talking about insurance. You don't buy fire insurance because you want your house to burn down. You buy it because you know the risk is real. Gold is fire insurance against a government that is playing with matches. It is the only financial asset that is not someone else's liability. It is the only way to be your own central bank. The system is designed to trap you in the dollar. The survivor's log shows the exit. The only question left is, do you have the courage to take it before the window closes? Because the rule of 72 proves that hesitation isn't just a delay, it is a confiscation. The math is indifferent to your hope. It follows the rule of 72. Divide 72 by the real inflation rate, not the government's 3% lie, but the actual 10% you feel at the grocery store. That equation proves your liquid savings will lose half their purchasing power every 7 years. Doing nothing isn't staying safe. It is a mathematical decision to surrender half of your life as work to the system we just exposed. We have covered the miscalculation, the print, and the trap. We are currently living in stage 3, and the next phase is the digital transition, the potential introduction of central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. This technology fundamentally changes how money functions. I'm releasing a full technical breakdown of this new monetary architecture next Friday. It includes the specific timeline for implementation. Subscribe now so you are positioned before the news cycle catches up.